Hey, what's up? This is Activation Key here. The world of fashion is a pretty big place, filled with all kinds of different aesthetics, subgenres, communities, etc. Techwear clothing is one of them, an effective subgenre of streetwear focusing on utilitarian futuristic design, combining performance, functionality, and aesthetics. By this point, a lot of people will be familiar with this kind of look, or at least have some idea of what it might look like. After all, thanks to the magic of the internet, you can easily search the word techwear on your favorite search engine, or browse through techwear hashtags on social media platforms like TikTok or Instagram. You'll find a wealth of self-described techwear content. The nature of fashion is that trends come and go. All kinds of styles have their time in the sun. We've seen Jerry boys, Eddie boys, hypebeasts, normcore, all rise and fall in recent years. On the face of it, there's never been more techwear content than ever, both in the hashtags of Instagram and TikTok, but even within more dedicated subreddits and discords, there are still people asking, "I've just found out about techwear, where do I start?" That doesn't sound like something coming to the end of its life, but I'd like to investigate techwear's place in the fashion trend cycle. Where does it fit right now in fashion? Is there anything to be gained from the techwear clothing aesthetic? And most importantly, should you care about the term techwear clothing at all? People often cite Google Trends as a way of quantifying interest in stuff, so we might as well start there. Taking a look at the trend graph globally, its peak looks like it was around mid-2021, with a bit of a decline since then. So, video over everyone, the Google line is going downwards. However, I'd argue this is a fairly weak way to measure genuine interest and enthusiasm in a particular topic. All it's doing is tracking searches for the term techwear over platforms like Google and YouTube. If you're a car fan, for example, you're not going to Google car every day. You're going to be looking at more specific engines, parts, models, things like that. The closest equivalent with techwear clothing would be looking at particular brands. And yes, these things are often seasonal, but they're relatively consistent over time. Further, you only have to change the search term to techwear, and suddenly things look a little bit different, with the peak being basically right now. And although the search volume for this term is lower compared to the single word version, the fact that people are looking for this right now suggests that there is still interest around this topic. It seems like people still want to know what techwear actually is, which is one of the big reasons I started making these videos back in 2016. Results inconclusive from this, I feel, but it's hard to look at this trend info and say, techwear's had its time in the sun and now it's kind of declined and it's over. What about a dedicated community though? In theory, this would more accurately show the state of things. The techwear clothing subreddit is one of the biggest places to discuss genuine techwear clothing. And yes, there is still very regular posting and regular discussion here, but it feels like more recent posts garner less upvotes and attention than ones a year or 2 years ago. This could definitely point to a decline, but even then it's very difficult to use this as conclusive evidence. Perhaps techwear clothing or this kind of content just isn't really favoured as much in the Reddit algorithm anymore. People just might not be seeing it. Or maybe there's been back-end changes since a year ago to the way that upvotes are counted. This has happened multiple times in Reddit's history. But we have to admit it could signify people joining the techwear clothing community in the past and later drifting away to something else, or overall a lower level of interest in the typical techwear look. But what is the typical techwear look anyway? For everyone but the core enthusiast, it's whatever comes up when you search for techwear online. Military influenced clothing, all black, very tactical, lots of straps everywhere, very skinny or slim tapered silhouettes. This is something we've talked about before. To the real flag-waving techwearian, all this stuff is inaccurate. They might say, well, it's somewhere between military or outdoor performance clothing and high fashion. You could probably get a 1,000-word essay about exactly what techwear is and what it isn't and what it looks like. But to the more casual observer or someone dabbling in this aesthetic, it's the more easily recognizable design elements which float to the top, particularly those which can be replicated affordably. Because let's be clear, a Gore-Tex jacket or something with very advanced construction prices out a lot of people, and maybe in a way that is not that easy to tell why at first glance. Adding some rudimentary cargo pockets or strap detailing doesn't necessarily, and nobody really is going to think, I've just discovered this cool techwear clothing thing. I think I'll go and spend $1,000 on a jacket. Only the real hardcore people who have really committed a lot of time and resources to learning about this kind of fashion are likely to be the ones doing that and dropping that amount of money. Even I, as someone who's made content on this topic every single week, it still took me years until I plucked up the courage to actually buy an acronym jacket for myself. When we're thinking techwear, we should have this disparity in mind. What the hardcore fan interprets as techwear clothing, and what the casual fan, newcomer, or observer thinks is techwear clothing are likely very different. And as with anything, the number of casual fans far outnumbers the real hardcore ones. The creation of this divide in my eyes goes back to around 2015, and I promise this is relevant to the topic at hand. This style of clothing had already been around for quite some time, but it's really when the term techwear clothing started getting thrown around a lot more in wider fashion circles, and it's certainly where I started being a lot more conscious of this term and this style. At the time, there weren't many alternatives to the look that you would get by combining brands like Nike Lab ACG, Acronym, and Gorilla Group. And all three of them were relatively expensive. It's totally reasonable then for a market to emerge catering to those people who feel, well, I'd like to dress like this, but I don't want to pay this, so I'm willing to do away with these elements. This is what we see a lot of now, the techwear aesthetic, or tech ninja look, or warcore, or darkwear, whatever you want to call it. That's kind of a topic that we've gone into in more detail in a different video. This look had its roots in a very particular era of 2015-2016 technical clothing. I think this applies a lot to the brands available on Taobao and AliExpress, as well as the multitudes of dropshippers who purchase their products and resell them under the guise of being techwear stores. But also brands like Orbit Gear or Antwon who have been influenced by particular acronym products and provided alternatives at a more affordable price. Let me be clear, that's not a call out on those specific brands or anything. I have things from both that I very much enjoyed using, but I think there's a difference between those kinds of brands who have built or created this idea of techwear clothing or what it is, and other sorts of brands who have joined on a little bit later. And what of those brands who, in my eyes, popularized this particular techwear clothing or tech ninja look, that 2016 aesthetic which seems to be in so many people's minds when they think about what techwear clothing is today in 2022? Well, we can strike Nike Lab ACG off the list, it's no longer in production. Gorilla Group has changed their aesthetic multiple times now, and their current output looks quite different to the typical techwear look, favouring more sartorial cuts and using as much pure white as edgy tech ninja black. Stone Island Shadow Project, the experimental and urban-focused line of Stone Island, creators of some of the most iconic techwear clothing cargo pants, now focus a lot of their output on very bold prints and patterns and colours. Don't get me wrong, I think the stuff in their last season has been some of their strongest in years, and they've got some really cool stuff, but it's clearly quite different to what they were doing before. Valence is using more bright colours than ever and aligning themselves closer with the mainline Arc'teryx brand by selling their products on the same site. Even Acronym, arguably the brand representative of this style, whose designs have trickled down into the designs of so many others and been copied as recently as this year, has moved away from those ultra-militarized looks that you would have seen in the mid-2010s. Okay, they re-released the P10A this season, which is the archetypal tech ninja pant, but look at their new designs. The P39N, a straight-legged, very plain, minimal pair of pants at a more affordable price. FC3 bucket hat, J94, their take on a varsity jacket. Even the J96, which is the more futuristic of the bunch, also comes in this khaki colour, which doesn't exactly scream utilitarian futuristic. It's much more outdoor performance hiking enthusiast than it is cyberpunk cosplayer. What's clear is these core brands have left behind the seemingly narrow, well-defined idea of what techwear clothing is. You could argue this is for business reasons. Maybe they see no future buyers in this particular look. They're forced to diversify. In my opinion, it's more likely that they feel like, well, that style has been done, so let's experiment and explore different areas. Nonetheless, if these brands turn their attention away from the conventional techwear look, we're left only with the brands around them, the brands designed in reference to them. With no new material left to reference, will they be able to continue innovating or doing something new, or put out these tactical, pocket-heavy, tapered, all-black clothes without that same willingness to change until they sort of fade away. What you've probably inferred is Techwear Clothing is dead in the water without these true innovators to push the style forwards. The Grim Reaper is checking his fashion watch. There's only so many pictures of the same XG/XF drop-shipped jacket people can see without getting bored. I think this has already happened. Outside of that very dedicated core community, #Techwear on social media hasn't really changed in years. In fact, even within that core community, people regularly joke about people making outfits using exactly the same acronym jacket and pants, the fabled Errolson uniform. However, I think it's all a matter of semantics. Some of those new pieces I showed don't look like #Techwear Google page 1 material, and if you asked a casual Techwear fan or someone with a relatively rudimentary understanding of the style whether this thing or this thing looks more Techwear, they probably wouldn't opt for the new acronym stuff. And yet we see the same advanced feature sets, experimentation, high-end materials, situational appropriateness for urban wear and utilitarian style, just wrapped up in a slightly different package. In my opinion, what constitutes Techwear clothing is a lot wider than what Google or social media will show you. There is absolutely room for creativity within this term, and I think incorporating different styles, more relaxed cuts, even taking inspiration from different areas of performance clothing, of course outdoor performance gear and stuff, as much as military garments, all of those can be effective ways of doing that. And two, most importantly, these same principles are showing up in areas far wider than the #Techwear community. You're seeing performance fashion stuff more and more in streetwear and popular fashion. Look at Salomon sneakers, for example. They're super on trend at the moment, and they're futuristic, they're performance focused. It's hard to argue that these kinds of things are not Techwear shoes. And performance jackets, nylon pants, hiking clothing, all of this stuff is being worn more and more. And do the results necessarily belong on the #Techwear inspo lookbook or whatever? No, but it satisfies a lot of the criteria for what makes Techwear clothing interesting. I really don't want to end on a cringeworthy Techwear is dead, long live Techwear type thing, but essentially this is what I'm getting at and the conclusion of something that's been on my mind for some time. Techwear clothing in its established form I think has stagnated, and I think fewer and fewer people are going to be interested in it. And I think it's only a matter of time before levels of interest in that very particular look start to wane. But at the same time, without people really noticing, Techwear clothing conceptually has kind of assimilated itself into streetwear and the wider fashion circle. This validates something that I felt for a long time and mentioned in quite a few videos before. You don't need to think about Techwear clothing in these very narrow, defined terms, or think only in terms of I must wear Techwear in a Techwear outfit. And don't let anyone tell you that if you're wearing some technical or pocket-heavy cargos, you have to be wearing a high-performance jacket and a chest rig and a samurai sword and all this stuff alongside it. It just isn't true anymore, and doing that, I think, is less fashionable than taking this more versatile approach. So yes, the Techwear or Tech Ninja trend just isn't hitting like it used to, but in its place, I think, is something more interesting. More people willing to experiment with some of these performance fashion ideas and taking more interest in the idea of fashion or clothing as something that can have these cool performance elements that can actually do something for you as the wearer. Keeping the good stuff like utility, versatility, construction quality, interesting aesthetics, but rejecting this very prescriptive idea of what Techwear clothing has to look like. These concepts give value and authenticity to what people wear and also give it some immunity to the trend cycle, because there might not always be a place in fashion for the edgy cyber hacker warrior, but there will always be a place for high quality item of clothing designed for a particular environment or purpose. Also, this doesn't necessarily mean anything monumental because I'm organizing all of these thoughts, which I've kind of already mentioned in different places down into one video. For years I've covered a whole range of clothing, from the edgiest, tech ninjaist, murdered out stuff right the way to full on hiking gear and pretty much everything in between. And I'll continue to do so, just as I will continue to combine those sorts of aesthetics and probably bring in new ones that I think are interesting. My interest is really in technical or performance fashion conceptually, or fashion innovations, or how technology and fashion can sort of combine. And tech ninja looks are still definitely part of that and something that I still enjoy, but so has other stuff too. Ending on a bit of a personal note there, but what is your take on techwear clothing? Do you agree with this idea that techwear clothing as a prescriptive style is kind of over? Or maybe the term itself, techwear, is kind of outdated? Really hope to see some great conversation in the comments. I will be checking through them for sure. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a like. It is massively appreciated. It really helps out the channel. And despite the topic of this video, we will of course be back next week with some interesting technical clothing stuff of some description. So if you want to see that, make sure you subscribe. There's going to be more videos up there that you can check out if you want. But that's all for this week. Catch you next time.